Welcome to Writing on Wednesdays. This week I want to talk about writing with the head versus the heart and reality versus fantasy. I read an article this past week that talked about mythos and logos. It's called Satanic Panics and the Death of Mythos by Aisling McCrae, and it originally appeared on thecurrentaffairs.org. So you can read the whole article for yourself. But the basic, because it actually talks about a lot more, like about how mythos and logos relate to the satanic panic in the world as a whole. But I'm going to talk about like a more myopic view of it and just think about it in terms of writing. Mythos means fiction, things that aren't true, myth, and logos is the opposite. It is things that are true, reality, logic, head versus heart, logic versus fantasy, that kind of thing. What the article really touched on, though, is the way that mythos can also be true, even if it's not literally true. It's the idea, I think, kind of how parables tell us truths about the world, like Aesop's fables can tell us truths while not actually being true themselves. A fox doesn't really talk to a dog and trick into being an apple or whatever it was. I totally botched that. But the ideas from the story still can be true. How those truths can still be important to us and how we can sometimes get so bogged down on being literal. But it also got me thinking about how we really, as a society right now, especially at least in America where I live and I've always lived, there's a emphasis put on logos, on true, and that's great. I mean, I think that the idea that logic and truth should be pursued sounds like a good idea, but it misses the other kind of truths, the ones that are harder to explain, that can't be defined, that we live in. And I think that sometimes an over definitions can make things constraining and inflexible. And life needs to be flexible and it needs to be malleable. And I think that writing in a lot of ways should be that way too. I think when I started writing, I was definitely writing from the heart. It's mythos that really made me fall in love with storytelling. And I think for a lot of people it is. I mean, that is what drives storytelling. It's fictionalizing truths in a lot of ways. It's making reality palatable, and it's also a way to share information in an entertaining way. And so I think the mythos and the storytelling really are tied together. As I've talked about in other writing videos, when I started writing and publishing, I started self-publishing originally, and then my books really kind of took off, and then I landed a publishing deal. But because of the way that I had went my books, so it had always been kind of like been rejected by a bunch of my publishers. Then I self-published and they happened to kind of take off. But they didn't get any awards either. They got a lot of like positive reviews, but they also had a lot of complaints. And people would say these are fun books, but they're not winning any literary awards, which is true. They weren't and they aren't. And so that kind of, the kind of derision that I felt from it, that they were still less than other books, when I finally got to a publisher, I really felt the need to prove myself. And I think ever since then, I have been trying to prove myself, and I've gotten way too focused on the logos, on trying to make things logical and clever and smart and have a world that all makes sense and all the math adds up. But I'm not focusing on the heart, which is actually what drove my books initially. That's why I wrote them. It was about the heart, the emotion that I wanted to carry. And it was emotions that carry through some of maybe the plot holes in some of my books or issues. I mean, that's why people read them, even though they weren't perfect literary pieces of fiction, because the mythos was still really strong. There was a truth of emotion in there that carried people through them. And people loved it, and I loved writing it. But I felt like I wanted to be better, that wasn't good enough, that being good at mythos is still not good because logos is better. I need to get good and write these good literary things that will be wildly accepted and win awards. And the reality is, I don't think that's who I am. That's at least, I mean, I think the two things can go together, and that some people can be fully driven by mythos and still write incredibly beautiful purple prose that wins tons of awards and is really well acclaimed. So I don't want to think that I'm making blanket statements about fiction in general. I'm talking a bit more specifically to me, but just about in general how the writing process is. If you focus too much on structure and being clever and world building, you lose sight of the actual mythos of the story. I think you need to have heart to push it. So this isn't what I had planned to talk about this week. I've been, trying to answer your questions and see what you guys wanted to talk about. But after I stumbled across this article, I really felt like this was something that I wanted to speak on, because it's something that I feel like I've been facing and working through this whole past year, because I've been really just like totally taking apart my writing in my head and stripping it down to what do I want to write and why do I want to write it. And I think that that's really what this is about, is you need to focus on the kernels of why you want to write the story, and worry less about audience and awards and reviews. And that's really hard to do, especially if you're a published author. It can be hard to do, because that's this is your work. You do this because you write because you love it, but you also write because it's your career, and you don't want to lose your career because, again, you love it, at least if you're me. And so trying to figure out how to do things that are true to you but make an audience happy is like the greatest trick. And I don't know. I don't think that is an easy one. It's a constant balancing act. It's a constant looking between things. But I think I had gotten so focused on trying to please people that I was never going to please, that I lost sight of writing the books that I'm actually meant to be writing, If that makes sense. So this week's advice is to have you take a look at whatever it is you're writing, or if you're getting ready to write, if you're already in the middle of writing, wherever you are in your process, and take a look at it and ask yourself, why am I writing this? What is pulling me? What is the thing that actually matters? Why I'm telling this particular story? Because even if you want to be a writer, you can write, like, there's a million different stories. I mean, a million variations of like 10 basic themes, but there's like a million variations. And so you've chosen to write this particular one for a reason. And you should figure out what that is, because that's actually what's really driving you. And I've had some breakthroughs and things that I've worked through in therapy, and I don't want to go into it too much because it's more like personal stuff, but I will say, going back and looking at my books, it's really obvious to me these issues that I said that I didn't have, that every one of my characters does have, and that they're the same basic issues that they're working through that I was denying in myself, because that was part of the truth that I was telling. I was working through something on like a meta level in my brain that I didn't realize that I was working through it. And so that's part of it too. And I'm not saying that all books are therapy and all books are therapeutic. Some tropes you just like because you just like them. But there's always like a reason why you like these tropes, and there's something in there. And tropes aren't like, I used to be very much like, oh, you can't have tropes, and some tropes are harmful. Like, look for harmful tropes, try not to do those tropes. But tropes in general, everything is a trope, basically. You're never going to write anything that's not. You're either going to be flipping a trope, or you're going to be doing a trope. That's it. That's basically every story idea ever. And so don't get too hung up on avoiding tropes in general, but do try to avoid ones that are problematic or harmful to people, because there are some that are. There's racist tropes, for example. Don't do those tropes. But in general, like benign tropes, go nuts, And so take a look at what stories you're telling, why you want to tell it, what draws you to these stories, what draws you to these tropes, and really focus on that, and don't worry about logic so much until you get through the other drafts. Write your first story, and there might be like giant plot holes that you'll have to solve in revisions, but I think it's important that you allow the mythos in your heart to control the first draft, and then logic and brain to come into the second. And so just write whatever it is you want to write. Use all your word crutches too. I have like a lot of writers have word crutches. One of mine is just. I would put the word just in every sentence if I could. Like, I just love it. But so it's stuff like that. Leave that in there. I used to try and like remove it as I was writing, and then it just slows down the whole process. And I think that's part of it. Again, for some reason, just feels good to me to put in there. So put in all your stuff, and then just go and remove it in revisions. Remove the things that don't work. But you can still leave some of your, idiosyncrasies in there. Don't erase yourself. This book is written by you, and you want it to be written by you, and not just any person, not some perfect AI machine who can put out stories. This is written by you, a flawed human being, and your characters are supposed to be like flawed driven characters, and it's okay for them to have these mistakes in there too. That's what makes them whole. And it's also okay sometimes if you don't have mistakes right away, because sometimes it's fun to have characters that, like wish fulfillment characters aren't necessarily bad either. People like wish fulfillment. People like fantasizing. Sometimes people just need to escape, and sometimes during the escape you can find truths you didn't expect. Next week I'll be back with more of a standard writing on Wednesdays, like where I give you more just like basic advice. But this one was just something that I really felt like I wanted to talk about. And I think it's still really important to storytelling and looking at where you are and where you want to go. And also making sure that you're chasing dreams that will actually fulfill you instead of ones that you feel like you're supposed to want. Thank you for tuning in, and I really enjoy making these videos. I hope that you enjoy watching them. I hope that I've been helpful. I'll be back next week with more writing advice, and until then, happy writing. If you like this video, please be sure to hit the like button, and you can subscribe.